What? Hello and welcome back, and it's time for another Before You Buy. And today, as the title suggests, we are talking about rack mount servers. We are talking about these massive monster chassis arriving these days in small and big forms. A number of users who are, classing themselves as home or prosumer based are starting to look at rack mount solutions. They have pros, they have cons, and arguably rack mount solutions are no longer just the target audience of high-end business, with lots of SMB, small medium business, and prosumer users getting in on the act. So if you are thinking of buying a rack mount solution or are on the fence about choosing between a desktop or a rack mount solution, today's video I'm going to talk about some of the big key decision points, be it as a buyer or general hardware user, that you should bear in mind before you go down this road. So the first thing that's worth bearing in mind with rack mount servers, and one that a lot of people who have never had much first-hand experience with them or not seen them outside of a giant server room, is that these things are insanely noisy. And by insanely, I know that's an incredibly relative term. It is true. These devices, when they are in operation, are not the quietest. We did a video for this NAS not a week and a bit ago. This is the RS2821 Plus, and it is a big one. It's a 16-bay rack mount chassis. But the noise it makes when it's spinning up, as well as when it's in operation, to me is comparable to being close to a plane. It is not quiet, and if you are going to use one of these, bear in mind that it's no longer a case of being just in the same room as it. I am talking, you will hear this thing through multiple walls when in operation. So do make sure, if you are going to take advantage of a rack mount solution in your home or SMB environment, to factor in that noise. Stick it in a soundproofed rack mount cabinet. Stick it inside a location that's well walled off. And we are talking, even if you go as low as 4-bay models, like the RS1619XS plus that Xeon 4-bay, do bear in mind these things make a lot of noise, and while we're at it, do actually utilise a fair old bit of power as well. The power consumption of these devices, for multiple reasons that we're going to talk about later in the video, are noticeably higher than even the same 4-bay rack mount versus 4-bay desktop, 8-bay versus 8-bay, etc., etc. Rack mount devices generate a lot of noise. One, because of the internal makeup and the chassis, and the fact that airflow has to pass horizontally through the system. There's no real vents on either of the sides because generally they're in cabinets, and those fans have to draw the air through it as much as possible on these systems. This one even has fans on the rear and the middle of the chassis, so air is being pushed through on these fans, and that in conjunction with enormous hard drive arrays makes a big old racket. And of course all of these add up to a large power consumption there, so make sure you bear those in mind. The next point, again, you sort of saw it coming off the point of what I just said about noise and power. Rack mount solutions, even if they are near enough identical to a desktop model in terms of the traditional CPU, the memory, the PSUs being utilised, upgrade slots, the controller board inside, rack mount solutions almost always arrive at around 15 to even 50% more in price. And I know off the base of it you're thinking, well, that's criminal. How on earth can they justify that increased price tag? And I will get to that in a second and see our viewpoints on that. But yes, if you look at any of the brands, and of course we are going to focus a little bit more on Synology and QNAP than anyone else in this area. If you look at, for example, the Synology RS1221 Plus and compare that against the DS1821 Plus, those two NAS systems genuinely are near enough identical. In fact, in many regards, the desktop device is better, with the desktop device having M2 NVMe upgrade slots, the desktop device being expandable with more drives, 18 rather than 12, and being more compact and smaller, and utilising less power whilst in operation and making less noise. It's arguably better. So how exactly does a near enough identical rack mount solution, with arguably its wings clipped in a few ways, justify that increased price? Well, first and foremost, as mentioned, there's a lot more work that goes into the chassis of a rack mount. That design and much more proactive airflow as well as directional airflow is something that desktop solutions have, but by no means the same way. They can have vertical and horizontal passive airflow in conjunction with the fans. Also, they're a smaller system to push the air through, whereas rack mounts will generally have to have a lot more distance to cover, and with all of their components spread out over a wider area, the result is a lot more work goes into their design. And unfortunately, the more work goes into the R&D of a product, arguably it means that more of a return has to be generated. Also, the sheer physical hardware being utilised in these devices mean a higher bare metal price tag, and that's something that's reflected. But probably one of the main areas that I think that rack mount devices generate that additional cost compared with that of desktops, and again this does vary from brand to brand and hardware to hardware, is that rack mount devices almost always arrive with either 3 years or 5 years warranty straight off the bat. That is the brand's way of saying not only will they support you for that period, but by default this system is designed to last once, if you are using it consistently every single day to the maximum they suggest, it will last that period of time faultlessly. Whereas a desktop device, you generally find them with 2 or 3 years warranty, with very few desktop comparable systems with the same hardware as rack mount arriving with greater than that. They can all be expanded, but ultimately the bare metal cost, the engineering and the warranty are why rack mount devices cost more. And obviously the more powerful systems you go into, and this I'm looking at QNAP, if you look at their XT series, the X series, or even the 73A series, with those systems, their rack mount devices have longer warranties, have better engineering in the external chassis design, and just generally give you a lot more. They can even be expanded a little bit more too. So that is where you see that larger price increase too. Now, next, we want to talk about PSUs, power supply units. These are the devices that keep the device running. And although I'm sure this is the point that all of you already know, there will be a few of you that don't. Rack mount solutions typically arrive, once you go larger than about 8 or 12 bays, will always arrive with 2 power supply units. So, in the case of this device here, once again, the RS2821RP Plus, you have 2 power supplies inside. That doesn't double up the power. You don't suddenly have twice the amount of power inside. What these do, and these are 550 watt PSUs each, is they run simultaneously. You connect 2 power connectors to your device and they run the device concurrently. They're running together parallel. And if in the event your PSU dies, the system will not power down at all. It won't even miss a beat because this PSU is still powering the whole system. It doesn't require the combined 550 watt or 1100 watts of 2 PSUs. It only requires the one to power all the drives, the CPU, the memory, PCIe, and more. Now, why is that a factor that you should be concerned with on a rack mount? Well, twofold. Number one, the dual PSU architecture of a rack mount will increase the price by around £200 to £300. If you look at all of the ranges from Synology and QNAP that are optional redundant power supply, generally you find the letter RP at the end or RP in the middle of the model ID, and typically we are talking to about 8 bays, some early 12 bays. The result is that device will suddenly have a price hike. So bear in mind that if you want a redundant power supply model, you might not get it by default and you will have to pay more. The second thing about redundant power supplies that a lot of people overlook and don't realise is a number of people assume that a rack mount will have a redundant power supply because it is so heavily associated with rack mount devices in the same way handles and rails and stuff are, that they will buy a device thinking it has a redundant PSU and it doesn't. So again, redundant power supplies are certainly worth a consideration when looking at these devices, whether you want them or not, because they will either cost you money that you didn't plan on spending, or they will not be there when you want them to be. Now, the other thing about rack mount devices that a lot of people don't seem to realise when compared with desktop is rack mounts are typically way more upgradable. Now, to really see this play out across ranges, once again, you have to go above about the 12 bay mark. 12 bay, 16 bay, and bigger. And at that point, that's where you start to see the better CPUs. You see the better amounts of memory, more slots of memory, better PCIe slots on the rear. So no longer are you restricted to the one slot, you start seeing 2 slot and 3 slot, and greater bandwidth as well, because the greater CPUs bring greater PCIe lanes for the system to play with, the CPU PCI lanes and the controller CPU PCI lanes. So you end up with the ability to use times 8, times 16 cards, which bring an enormous amount of bandwidth between the connected cards inside and the controller board. So again, bear in mind that rack mount devices give you way more upgradability, and if you are looking to buy a rack mount early doors, often, and this definitely applies to some of the Synology models, when you look at some of the 12 base from Synology and you look at the ones that are powered by, say, an Intel Atom, or the ones that are powered by the Ryzen embedded V1500B, they are quite pricey. But if you spend another 500, 600, 700 nicker, you suddenly scale up to the next tier, which is the one that has the Xeon processor, the one that has 4 memory slots, the one that has dual PCIe slots, or even onboard 10 GBE, and has 5 years of warranty. And also, when you spend that little bit extra, when you graduate up from a £2,000 box to 2.5, or 2.5 to 3.5, you also have the expandability. You have the ability to no longer, in the case of this device, add one 12-hour expansion. You can start adding multiple and bigger expansions too. So again, the upgradability of rack mount is something that I don't think people talk about enough. And when you do buy a rack mount device and you spend that little bit more for the more scalable devices, they also arrive with longer warranties as well, with 5 years straight off the bat. Now, for all my talk about rack mount devices, it's also worth highlighting, when I talk about how big and crashingly noisy and powerful and obtusely in your face they are, rack mount devices in the last 4 or 5 years have had their own kind of rebuild renaissance, and a number of them are now a great deal more compact. There are, weirdly, even 2-bay rack mount solutions in the market, which to me, pointless. Tell me why I'm wrong, RS217 in case you're wondering. But there's 4-bay rack mount solutions and 8-bay rack mount solutions that are only 30 centimeters deep. This one is huge, I think 60 or to 65 centimeters deep. It is hugely crazy. I mean, that is twice the depth of this 8-bay from QNAP here. So these smaller depth rack mount chassis at 30 centimeters deep, and the standard width across, I think, 40 centimeters or so. The result is that some rack mount chassis are actually the same size in volume, or even a fraction smaller than some desktops. We are talking TS873AU, the RS1221 Plus. These rack mount devices aren't actually all imposing. These are devices that have PCIe upgradability still, that have storage upgradability, but are incredibly compact. These are ones that will reduce that noise and reduce that power footprint, not this, to the same height of that of a desktop, but still very, very close. And they allow users to take advantage of rack mount chassis and rack mount deployment without having to think about their energy bill going through the roof, and without having to corner off an entire area in the house in breeze block in order to take advantage of it. So before you buy a rack mount, and if you are worried about power and noise, do take the trouble to research if the brand you're going for has a half depth model available, because they can solve a lot of those problems we've mentioned thus far. One of the last things to talk about when it comes to rack mount devices is very much the end of the spectrum, and that is dual controller architecture. Now, this is something we've still yet to ever see inside a desktop device. One of the reasons people buy rack mounts is because they feel they have a degree of recovery that desktop doesn't. That dual PSU architecture there, the fact that the system has such larger storage arrays that they can put more, more redundant drives in there, create more volumes or more separate storage pools, create combined or cluster RAIDs as well. These are systems that can allow you to create many, many safety nets. Remember, not backups, safety nets from much larger redundancy RAID configurations that have 1, 2, 3, or even more failover drives for you. Also have the failover PSUs. But rack mounts also start to bring this idea of, as Synology call it, Synology high availability, or just generally DC architecture, dual controller architecture, whereby although the drives might all be one giant storage pool, or you can even halve them if you choose, you also have the option of having two controller boards inside, two CPUs, two lots of memory, two lots of ports, two lots of PSUs, and although that will cost through the roof, it has to be said, it gives you redundant everything. Stick a UPS on there as well, universal power supply, and you end up with a system that has got so many failovers, and again, failovers and redundancy are not the same as backup, but nonetheless, dual controller architecture, for a number of people that have bought a Rackmount NAS for business because it's the done thing and they feel like it's the right choice, normally do that because they're given this sense, this vibe, the Rackmount devices can take more of a knock and your business can survive more hits. And redundant controller architecture is straight in that wheelhouse, and certainly something that a number of you should bear in mind, because dual controller architecture is no longer just curfew of big business. Moving away, slightly away from Rackmount there for a second, dual controller architecture is still now available hugely on Synology's high availability, where you can buy two NASes, same drives, link them up. You have a high availability setup, check out my video. And QNAP themselves are working on, within QTS and QUTS, their own version of that that's got a few extra means of active passive or active architecture there, where you have either two devices that you can both use, or one as a safety net, primary, secondary. That's about it really. Buying a rack mount device, most of the pros and cons we know, but it's just great to put them all here in a single video. I will add one more tiny one here at the end, because it is full of contention and one that people have argued back and forth on, and that is Rails. When you buy a Rackmount NAS and you've already got a rack cabinet already set up, you've already got, you know, the rest of your hardware, your bare metal, and one of these devices are going to arrive at your door, a lot of people think to themselves, right, I'm going to get that little rack mount for myself, I'm going to install it, and bam, I'm going to hit the ground running. Bear in mind that practically all the NAS brands do not include rails. These are either static rails that attach to bolts on the side, or sliding rails that allow you to pull a rack mount out of a cabinet using these handles here, and then change the cables, maybe put in a PCIe and slide it back. These systems do not arrive. They're an optional extra, arriving with different payment methods, and again, the prices do vary from brand to brand and type to type. Why do brands not include rails? I've asked the brands a few times about this, and generally I'm told, one, they assume that people have different setups and to include rails would, one, increase the price, two, they might provide rails that are just not needed, so it's a bit of a waste of production and natural resources to create those. Again, I'm not as convinced about that. It's a viable enough argument, but I still kind of think that these devices should arrive with rails, and ultimately what I'm saying is, make sure if you buy one of these devices that you know whether you want rails in advance, because if you needed rails, then that you're going to get to arrive, and then there's nothing you can do. You can try and build the drives and build it on the floor in a box, but that's not ideal. You want to make sure when you set it up in its environment first time. So a number of you will choose not to build a server until you've got those rails. That's another hugely unnecessary delay. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. If you are going to look at buying a rack mount solution, do bear in mind that these are enterprise grade devices and need to be treated as such, and a number of people will take a rather disposable attitude that they see on desktop devices and put that onto a desktop. These devices are geared towards high performance. These are the sort of devices that once you start to use dual port 10G, 25G cards, or even 40 gigabit Ethernet cards, these are the ones that can provide the CPU architecture and storage media to actually hit that bandwidth. But you've got to do it right with regards to cooling, with regards to rails, and with regards to deployments. If you need a helping hand, if you need to know more about the right system for you, and you need a bit of a hand, and you don't really want to hire some company for a few grand to give you data storage advice and tell you what to buy and still charge you for it, go into the comments and use the free advice section over on NAS Compares. It is genuinely free. It's myself and Eddie the Web Guy answering your questions. We don't charge for it. We don't do anything with your information when you chat an email address. We might, there's a few donate buttons down there. Might even use the odd affiliate link, but we'll tell you when we do. It is a free service. It might take an extra day or two for us to answer you. There's only the two of us, but I recommend using it. Of course I do. I'm going to respond to you, and we will answer every email. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.